So we just kind of looked at what a homelessness application actually is, but obviously to understand that fully, you need to understand what homelessness itself means. And I've said already, people sleeping rough on a high street are very much the tip of the iceberg as to who is actually homeless under the legal definition. There are hundreds of thousands, maybe even more than 1 million people in the UK, in England, who are legally homeless. And in one sense, to understand it, I'm going to kind of group the situations in which you'd be legally homeless into kind of sort of three main groups. If you're interested, it comes out of section 175 of the Housing Act, but you don't need to remember that. And it's covered within the Homelessness Code of Guidance, where it goes into a lot more detail. And one thing I haven't said yet actually is that although the statutory Homelessness Code of Guidance is called guidance, it's basically legally binding. So it's not like, it's not kind of like a suggestion on the councils. It is something which they have to follow unless they've got an exceptionally good reason not to. But basically, so homelessness, as I say, there's kind of three kind of different groups of people who would be homeless. So first of all, there are people who they don't have anywhere to live where they can legally occupy it. So that sounds, it's the most obvious one. So for example, most people sleeping rough obviously are not going to have a home that they just choose not to live in. Sometimes they will, by the way, but they're subject to abuse there, so they've kind of fled from it. So it's not that people are choosing to sleep rough. It's not really a fair choice. So basically people who've been evicted, people who just literally don't have don't have a tenancy or a license in a hostel or something, they would be legally homeless. The only kind of situation within it where it becomes a little bit more complicated is where you've got particularly young adults who are living with parents. So again, within the Homelessness Code of Guidance, if there are some paragraphs there about how you would work that out, whether that person is actually homeless, or whether they can legitimately stay with their parents or their family or whatever. So that's the first one. Fairly easy. The second one's pretty easy as well. So it's basically where you have a legal right to occupy somewhere, but you can't access it. And that's really probably be for one of two reasons. One is that you've been illegally evicted. So you've got a tenancy, but the landlord has come and changed the locks without serving notice, doing it properly. So you can approach your local authority and say, look, I've been illegally evicted. The landlord's changed my locks. Can you help me out, please? And they wouldn't put you in temporary accommodation, or well, they might do if they can't get the landlord to go back on it pretty quickly. But their first point of call will be to contact the landlord and say, you're breaking the law. We can potentially prosecute you for it. Sort it out. Go and change the locks back. And so that's how they would generally resolve it. So that's kind of that's a typical situation which would come under the second category. The other one would be, I'm not sure if I've ever actually seen it, but it's kind of there. Give an example. There was a case where. I think it was a Colombian lady. She had accommodation in Colombia. Let's say that much. I'm not sure what nationality she was. So although she had accommodation somewhere, she wasn't able to get to it because she didn't have the money for an airfare. So she was legally homeless. And up until she could access that home, she was legally homeless. So again, it's not something you'll see very often, obviously. But the third category is the most interesting one, and probably the one which has got the most people in it, but these are kind of the less obvious kind of forms of homelessness. So basically, the Housing Act says, section 175 says, someone shall be treated as homeless if they have accommodation which they have a legal right to occupy, but for some reason it is not reasonable to continue occupy that accommodation. So that reasonable to continue to occupy, that phrase there is really important. And so this kind of covers situations where, for example, you have a home, it's a perfectly decent home, nice home or whatever, but living there is likely going to mean that you're going to be subject to domestic abuse, even though you've got the home, even though you haven't fled from it yet. You are legally homeless because, in one sense, the law is saying a home is more than four walls and a roof. A home needs to be somewhere that's safe, somewhere where you can kind of, you can just kind of be at ease and kind of be settled. So, that's kind of one category. There's maybe a few more categories or subcategories within this kind of third part. So equally accommodation, you might have accommodation which you've got a legal right to occupy. So you've got a tenancy, but it's not reasonable to continue to occupy it because you can't afford the rent. So, this is a big problem within the private rented sector. Lots of properties require a top up out of someone's kind of living out expenses if they're on universal credit or whatever. Which is why, by the way, it's a big worry as to what happens with universal credit at the end of coronavirus, because if the rates come down again, lots of people will become homeless immediately. But yeah, so basically, you've got accommodation. It's okay. Physically, it's safe to live there, but you can't afford to live there. So it's basically not reasonable to continue to occupy it. Now, if you made a homeless application in that situation, you gave the council reasons to believe you might be homeless because you're saying I can't afford it. You're asking them for help. Now, they're not going to give you temporary accommodation. What they're most likely going to do, or if they're sensible, they're going to do is apply for a discretionary housing payment or support you to apply for a discretionary housing payment. So effectively your income is topped up enough to cover that shortfall in rent. So that's, there's more to say about that, but that's kind of, in a nutshell. Another kind of situation where you have accommodation, but it's not reasonable to continue to occupy would be where, say, as an example, you have an accident, you're now wheelchair bound or something, and your accommodation requires you to get up steps to it, or there's kind of stairs within the property, which means you can't get up and down the stairs to access the bathroom or bedroom or something. Now, again, you can make a homeless application in that situation, but again, councils, generally wouldn't provide you with temporary accommodation in that situation, or certainly not long-term temporary accommodation. They might do in the short term whilst they kind of figure stuff out. But what they generally do is they kind of make a referral to the occupational therapist. They'll come round, assess the property, and hopefully there'll be some aids and adaptations they can do to that property to make it, kind of habitable. So it might be a case of putting a stair lift in, or kind of level access shower, or whatever. So now that property is reasonable to continue to occupy. There's another subcategory of this one. There's a few more actually. So one, and this kind of comes out of a case from 2018 involving a lady called Miss Lomax, Wendy Lomax, and she had accommodation which was perfectly decent accommodation, but she had some significant mobility issues, and those mobility issues meant she couldn't get out and about. So she was very isolated. So she was living in West Dorset. Her family all live over sort of 60 or 70 miles away in Gosport. And as a result of this isolation, which was resulted in turn from her mobility issues, she was developing or had already got depression, and it was basically getting really bad. So her doctor was saying, look, this depression has now reached a stage where it would be classed as a disability because it's having a substantial impact on her ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So she approached Gosport Council. Gosport said, you're not homeless. She challenged it through the courts. And basically the judge said that, and this is a very high threshold, so it's going to apply to some people, but not everyone. The judge said, look, where someone has got a disability, so a protected characteristic, so where they have an impairment which has a substantial impact on their ability to carry day-to-day living activities for a long time, 12 months or more generally, and the accommodation is making that disability get worse, then they are homeless. Now, as I say, it's one of the few places in homelessness law where there's actually a high threshold, but do check out that. So something I haven't mentioned yet, really good resource is a blog called nearlylegal.co.uk. So it's run by a guy called Giles Peaker, who's a solicitor, really good solicitor. And it's kind of, breaks down these cases, which can be very kind of difficult to understand into layman's terms. So, if you search Nearly Legal Lomax, you would get Giles Peaker's kind of exposition of that case, because that is a situation which is complicated. There's no two ways about it. So you would want to go in kind of with a good understanding of it if you're going to make that argument. And then there's a few other kind of situations where you've got accommodation, but it's not reasonable to continue to occupy. So people living in women's refuges or night shelters, depending on their kind of the criteria they apply to their licenses. But basically, in both situations, it would not be reasonable to continue to occupy that accommodation indefinitely. So you are legally homeless. So everyone living in a women's refuge and everyone living in a night shelter should be supported to make an application if they want to. And what sane person wouldn't want to make an application? That's a bit harsh saying that. There are good reasons why you wouldn't want to make an application. For example, because you've had a really bad experience of making one before, and quite frankly, you could do without being treated like a scumbag by your local authority. but hopefully as a professional, you can support people through that process. And then you've got, I'm probably going to miss a few here, but you've got kind of people like, for example, who they live in a caravan, they've got nowhere to legally birth their caravan, so they would be legally homeless. And you've got probably a few other kind of categories as well. So, for example, like people living on a barge or something, they can't moor it somewhere. Which is interesting, when you've got kind of travellers who are, arriving at a village green or something, the council has reasons to believe they're legally homeless. So if those travellers are saying to a council, look, can you help us out? They've actually triggered a homeless application. I'm not quite sure how often that really gets accepted, because obviously councils tend to take a rather dim view and try to get people moved on. But technically, they might be breaking the law when they're doing that. The council might be breaking the law by not accepting the homeless application from those families, who would, almost certainly, they would be in priority need if they've got dependent children. So, as I say, homelessness is a lot more than just, just kind of people sleeping on the streets. There are hundreds of thousands, if not a million people who will be subject to domestic abuse in their home, won't be able to afford their rent, all of whom can make homeless applications and access additional useful assistance in dealing with those situations. The final thing I'd say about it, I hope, if I haven't forgotten anything else, is that if someone is likely to be homeless according to those definitions within 56 days, they can make an application now rather than wait until they're actually in that situation. So that kind of gives councils a chance to prevent that person becoming homeless, hopefully. So they've got more time to really deal with that person or that family. So 56 days, and I'm not going to go into it, but that's kind of where a prevention duty would kick in as well. Generally speaking, the prevention and relief duties just get very confusing, and to actually get people housed, you don't really need to know about them. Effectively, you just pretend like they're not there. All you need to worry about to get people housed is that 5-part test. So, which we've covered the first part of it. So, when someone makes a homeless application, the council then effectively have to answer 5 questions: are they homeless? Are they eligible? Are they in priority needs? Do they have local connection? Are they intentionally homeless? And we've just kind of covered that first one about when someone would be legally homeless. So the next video I'm going to do very quick on eligibility, and then I'm going to do quite a lot more on priority need and intentional homelessness and local connection. So do stay tuned. As I say, do like the video, subscribe, because it just helps this message get out there. And I'll see you in a minute.